Now, China and the European Union have agreed to hold talks over planned electric vehicle tariffs. The EU is struggling to compete in the sector and plans to hike tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. Emre Boz has more on how China's EV sector has grown and why Europe is so worried.
Imagine a company so big it has its own ship to meet customers' demands. This is the BYD Explorer #1, a vehicle carrier for China's biggest electric car maker. China has been busy. It spent more than $230 billion over the past decade to develop its electric car industry, according to reports. This equates to almost 19% of global electric car sales between 2009 and 2023.
I think China has a very, very strong future in terms of its electric vehicle industry. It will be a dominant power in the world for decades to come, and it's a matter of ensuring sustainable trade.
But this sustainable trade is being threatened by the EU, set to impose import tariffs on Chinese EVs up to 38%. Europe overtook Asia as China's largest EV export market in 2021. And analysts say this is because Chinese EVs have a much lower price tag. The EU accuses China of unfairly subsidizing EV firms, with European car makers struggling to compete.
The European Commission has requested a large amount of information from Chinese electric vehicle and battery companies in its anti-subsidy probe. The requested information includes production and business operations, development plans, technical processes, and product formulas. Although Chinese companies had done their best to cooperate and provide the requested information, the European Commission groundlessly accused them of insufficient cooperation and imposed punitive high tax rates as a result.
Critics of the tariff hikes say they won't push European car makers to become more innovative. They're only a band-aid fix to level the playing field for the European EV industry. China is able to mass-produce EV cars due to a supply chain that now branches out globally, able to meet demand from an international market. Last year alone, Chinese brands comprised almost 75% of all EVs sold in Southeast Asia, with Beijing increasing its manufacturing investments in the region to $1.44 billion in new production facilities. For European car makers, the tariffs offered temporary relief and a chance to win back local customers. But without further investment in the EV sector, it may not be enough. Emre Boz, TRT World.
For more on this, we're joined by Mark Humphrey-Jenner, Associate Professor of Finance at the University of New South Wales Business School. Great to have you with us, Mark. Now, China and the EU have agreed to these negotiations. What outcomes do you expect from these talks?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. And from these talks, we've got what we expect to happen and what the parties would like to happen. So China stated that it wants the tariffs effectively abandoned by July the 4th. Which is when they're set to come in. It's not clear that that will happen given how close we are to July. However, it's likely there'll be some movement toward a negotiated settlement, perhaps either fewer, lower, or perhaps less onerous tariffs being brought in, or perhaps a way for Chinese EV manufacturers to be able to avoid having to pay the tariffs. Potentially, they can demonstrate that they aren't dumping vehicles in the EU, or they can demonstrate they're not being subsidized. I would expect some movement toward that, or alternatively that China will highlight that it would impose tariffs on EU cars if EU doesn't back down. So we expect some progress, although we are a little bit early days at the moment.
Right, and if these talks, what would be the implications?
Yeah, so if the talks don't reach a settlement, well, we'd see initially greater tariffs on EVs coming out of China. Now, these would vary in magnitude, but we're talking potentially up to another 38% on tariffs for EVs coming out of China, which would obviously make those vehicles more expensive. And there would be some variation in the level of the tariff across manufacturers and the like. Now, in response to this, it is very likely that China would then impose tariffs on vehicles coming out of the EU. Those tariffs could be broadly on EVs, or they could just be on vehicles in general. In either case, they would be damaging to vehicle manufacturers in the EU. Now, in terms of how much this would affect consumers, well, it would really vary a little bit across consumer, of course. Not all consumers are even on the lookout for an EV. However, in terms of EV market penetration, China has about 7% of the EV market share in Europe, which could increase to about 10% in 2025 at least according to some of the estimates, suggesting it won't catastrophically affect consumers, but certainly it could make prices more expensive.
Right, and several analysts have pointed that these measures would only be a band-aid fix for Europe's EV industry. Why has it been struggling recently?
There are several reasons Europe's EV industry has run into problems, one of which is that they're often pricing vehicles at the relatively high end relative to any of the Chinese manufacturers or relative to manufacturers such as Tesla, which are often cheaper than the European equivalents. For example, Mercedes is often pricing itself above Tesla, which puts it in a very difficult position. Now, EVs in general are also struggling in many countries, albeit not all. This in part is due to the lack of infrastructure, i.e. where are you charging these cars and can you charge them at home? And if you can't, well, how are you using them? You've also got the issues in terms of expense. You've got the issues in terms of cost of living pressures, which have really been mounting up and perhaps causing some people to delay purchases or shift toward a cheaper vehicle. Then you've got the issue that a number of EVs have been rather reliant on government subsidies. For example, tax breaks when you go out and buy an EV. And as those start to scale down, you end up with issues in terms of affordability, or if they were to actually increase, then ironically, you end up with issues in terms of depreciation. And the depreciation curve ends up making them unfriendly to own. Of course, you just lose money if the subsidy comes in tomorrow, then your old car that you bought was at a higher price than what a new car would be bought at the moment, which creates a whole host of issues in terms of getting these off the ground.